Good morning, everybody, and welcome back to Elf Bait. It is I, Eli, also known as Elf Bait, and hope everybody's having a good weekend. Mine's off to a good start. I went out and spent way too much money at the local Asian grocery. I can make all sorts of delicious foods, and then I've got a game later on today after the stream with Saxius and crew, so that should be fun. All right, so today's topic is on why we kind of keep using the same old fantasy races and games. But it's more than that. I kind of wanted to talk about ways that you can play with those tropes and make for interesting fantasy game settings. Not necessarily even fantasy game settings, but we'll focus on fantasy. But also ways to things to avoid, things to look out, and things to avoid. Looks like we have a few folks watching. Grumpy, I see you're here. Good morning, Grumpy Old Slan. You made it on time. Congratulations. There were two others watching earlier, but hopefully they will be back. So, anyways, I guess I'll just kick it off and start here. It's not a huge topic, but it's definitely worth talking about. So, fantasy RPGs tend to stick to the tried and true. They may veer left or right from that center mark of dwarf, elf, gnome, human, halfling, a little bit here and there, but there's not a lot of variation in game settings. And when they do vary, it's usually very, very slight. And it's not so much even that those races are always there, but the fact that they are so often the tried and true kind of Tolkien-esque, or even at this point D&D-esque versions of those races. I think we can say that D&D has been around long enough to where it itself informs fantasy race design as much as literature does, and it is that sort of design that makes game settings safe and easily accessible, to the imaginations and the people who are consuming them. But it's also what makes them very samey. Good morning, Full Metal Dragon. We jumped up to 6 people, so cool. If you're here, say hi. So, I guess a good place to start would be with the why. And like I mentioned earlier, um, I think the main reason we see the same races over and over is that they're easy to communicate to players. They are um, the sort of thing that we can look at and we immediately know what they are. An elf is an elf, a halfling is a halfling, a dwarf is a dwarf. Um, and so it makes it really easy for a publisher to get people to interface with their game, and it cuts down on the amount of work that GMs and players have to do to really get get rolling in the game. Now they may have nuance and to their versions of those races, but uh, and those will be learned as you play the games, but they make it easy to get in the door, and then you can find out what makes them different as you go on. Um, I'll have to check those out. I have not seen many of them. I've read like the Thousand Islands, or heard about the Thousand Islands as a setting, but not um, any of the RPGs. RW Bishop, good morning. So yeah, so for simplicity's sake and for ease of access for players and GMs and getting the ball rolling, those standard races really do apply. And there's also a certain amount of uh, weight put on publishers in the name of nostalgia and tradition, and using other races in your fantasy games can often hit a little flat. I mean, it could be that if you are veering too far off from center field with your species in your game, then the fantasy community at large may not know what to think about it. I've fallen for this in the past. I mean, there used to be a game that was advertised in Dragon all the time called Joroon, and I've never seen Joroon in the wild, but the advertisements and stuff I saw from it, it was always just weird. And at the time, I wasn't into that, and so it just kind of missed me. Whereas something like Palladium, uh, which is for all intents and purposes just another D&D, it plays very similarly. It may not have all of the standard races, and it certainly has a lot of options for races that you wouldn't normally have in a D&D game, but its core is still there. Hey, Zactius. And so yeah, so I guess that would be the main reason I think we see it all the time. It's just because it's a safe way to write. And then the next thing would be what I was getting into is like if you are too interesting and weird and wacky with your game species, your game races, people may not know what to do with it. A really good example of too much of that is Talislanta. If you're familiar with Talislanta, there are literally hundreds of player options in there, um, with dozens and dozens and maybe 100 some odd different species, different races of people in that setting, and it becomes really impossible to really just look through that book and know what's what. And some of them are so similar. There's so many close variations. Like, their big tagline was "No elves," and while it was a cheeky, sort of, thumb your nose sort of a headline, tagline for their advertisements, um, it was not true. I mean, there was plenty of things in that setting that were elves and everything but name. You know, tall, graceful, sylvan people with magic. It's an elf. And I may not call him an elf. Full Metal Dragon. You're right. They went way out of their way to avoid Tolkien influence, and that's true. But I also feel like they went way too far. There was just so much going on there. I mean, I had all of the books from the first edition all the way up through the third edition, and I had read them and I looked through them, and the only way I could ever figure out how to run that game was to pick a place and have player options only be what was available in that place, and then work out from there. Everything else would be like NPC races, or the next time we ran a different campaign, it would be in a different location or something. Um, but yeah, so that's the flip side of it. While you have the super familiar and easily accessible, if you go too far and you have too much craziness, then people are just going to look at it and go, what do we got? And it becomes a balancing act. If you are going to introduce new and crazy races into your game, you may hear my dogs. I apologize. I'm one dog, but he's up there sounding like multiples. If you're going to use weird races, you have to sort of do a couple of things in my mind. You have to still have some sort of a grounded race to anchor the world, which is usually humans. But if you weren't going to use humans, then maybe one of the other standard races, from the kind of the Tolkien or standard fantasy trope. Then the other option would be to the other thing you need to make sure. Sorry, I got distracted. Somebody came in the door. The other thing that you would do is to make sure that you still keep your number of starting races small. D&D in every edition has kept its core races to a very minimal number and then expanded out from there. So if you're going to go with a crazy world full of brand new races, have only a few of them. That way the players have time to interface with those few species, and then they can play. I'm not interchanging species and race at the same time. I mean, species is more accurate, but fantasy games tend to use race. Let's see. I don't recall that game setting. I'm gonna bet it was probably some sort of air world kind of a setting where Sky Realm kind of a thing if everybody was flying. But so well, if Talislanta is a bad example, um, or like a cautionary example of how you can go too far um, with the crazy races, I think that a good example for that stands out in my mind, easily accessible to me because it's one of my favorites, would be the old ElfQuest comic. ElfQuest, first of all, it's a paleo fantasy, and so it sort of appeals to me. Had elves, humans, trolls, and fairies, and that was it. As an RPG, when it was released, all of those were available for um, as player races. But in the comics, the focus was on the elves. However, the elves were so varied and different in that setting that they were very much different races. And so that's another way you can go too, is you can break from those molds, those traditional molds, by making your own varieties, maybe focusing on one particular species or getting rid of some species and subbing in new ones, or attaching them where they weren't previously. In one campaign I ran, gnomes were not a distinct species of their own. They were just another form of dwarf. They were forest dwarves. They were all the same race, and so they were just you know we had that distinction was there. And then in that same setting, I didn't have half orcs. I had a race of half giants who, well, not half giants, they were descended from a line of giants, and so they were physically powerful, and they were species in their own right. They just used the same stats as the half orc, and so that was how I handled that. It still created a nice array of character races, but they were not the standard ones. And so, kind of getting back to that point of how do you make uh, new races that kind of don't break the bank like Talislanta did, is I think when I'm creating science fiction races, for example, at least for miniatures, I have sort of this balance in my head, and I've talked about it in other videos, where the weirder the alien looks, like physically, the more grounded I try to make its gear and stuff. So there's an anchor point for the brain of the player. With fantasy races that are going to be used on a tabletop RPG, I feel like if you're going to have really weird and wild physically appearing aliens, or in this case, fantasy races, making them have some sort of recognizable cultural affectation can help. Um, for example, let's say you're going to do a setting and you have a far eastern kingdom. Um, you could just decide that's where your dragonborn come from. Your dragonborn are the Eastern Empire. There aren't humans there. There's dragonborn. That's where they come from. And then, if you wanted to, you could sort of give them Asian motifs if you wanted to, and then that would work as a quick shorthand for that. You wouldn't necessarily be doing a disservice to Asian people or anything like that. You would simply be providing a familiar base for people who are going to play those characters. And we see it all the time. I mean, dwarves are shorthanded often as very Norse in games and in game settings. The very Norse-ish, or at least they've become that way. I feel this is one of those instances where the fantasy RPG dwarf has veered off from like the Tolkien-esque dwarf quite a ways. Is in the fantasy dwarves seem to almost universally have this Norse aspect to them, although they almost always, for whatever reason, have Scottish accents when people play them or depict them. So let's see. Other ways you can do it. Mechanically speaking, You don't even have to do a lot of work to make your new aliens or your new races for your fantasy setting, because you already have fantasy races in the game. And so one thing you can do is sort of take the Talislanta approach, even though for the most part I see a Talislanta as sort of a cautionary tale, not to repeat. As I mentioned, though, they had elves and everything but name, so you could easily uh, take the physical appearances of one of your species and give them the cultural affectations of another species. So maybe elves are in your campaign setting are actually more akin to gnomes. And so mechanically, your elves are now going to use gnome stats. Maybe your elves in your setting are actually more diminutive and secretive, like the mythological and folklorish elves. And so that small racial category of the gnome is now fitting for them. And so, poof, you've got elves where gnomes used to be. It's particularly useful if you're one of the many who don't like gnomes. Uh, you're fine mages. Uh, you know, you know, family comes first. It's always good. And in that case where you've now turned your elves into the gnomes, and you maybe have all these wonderful stat blocks around for a mystical humanoid with some innate magical powers, and you're not using it anymore, well, maybe you can go ahead and make a race of magic humans. So you have your basic humans, and then maybe you have a race of humans that is particularly magically adept, and now you're using the stats for elves for them. They're elves and everything but name, but you've got the stat block in there, and now your world has a different flavor to it because visually and maybe even culturally, because of course you can then write it out from there. You have these differences. Uh, yeah, and this is true. And keep in mind, I'm not even going into that. I mean, if you want the more nuanced your world is, the better. However, I would say as most games are written as much as games as they are worlds, there are often shortcuts that are taken to make them gameable. And that's kind of what we're talking about here too. I mean, you can do a lot in just applying cultural nuance to them, but you can do that regardless. I also feel like the venom and ire against races in fantasy games right now is a little undue because while yes, real world races and stuff are very nuanced, um, a they've always been presented as nuanced in games because there have often been different kingdoms of elves and different kingdoms of this, that, and the other. But also, we're talking about ostensibly creationist settings where elves are made by people and dwarves are made by people. So it's very possible for them to have distinct, innate biological abilities. Just like a red dragon has a certain set of powers that are ascribed to it merely by its nature as being a dragon, a red dragon. I think it's safe to say that elves in fantasy settings can justifiably all have the same base abilities. One can argue the more cultural aspects of that, and that's like the weapon skills and the proficiencies that they get. Um, and again, that comes down to how your world is building. A lot of that's kind of leftovers from Tolkien, who was writing very folkloric, very mythologically speaking, where things had an archetype to them. But even he had some nuance in there. But yeah, I mean, definitely stuff you can do, Grumpy, with that. But um, yeah, it's not a hugely deep topic. I mean, to be honest, I mean, breaking the molds. The thing is that it's what you need to look out for and ways to do it. Just to understand, like the crazier the race you make, the harder people are going to have to be able to interface with it. Monocultures exist in science fiction and fantasy mostly because we're not going to spend a lot of time getting to know those races that are not central to the story. Um, in fantasy games, it helps by making them playable, and games, period. It helps to make them playable. A Klingon is a Klingon. You know, an elf is an elf, a dwarf is a dwarf. And also, I feel like there's always been that permission for GMs to individually change things up as they may, and that's existed since the dawn of gaming. So what the game designers are doing is providing you with a framework and a test bed, not a test bed, but a bed, you know, a kind of a you know a foundation for how the game will run, and then you can customize on that. The one thing that I do like with the newer discussion on player races is it is creating systems by which DMs and players can create uh, variation and more easily customize their setting within the rules. I feel like that's best done on the DM side of things and not leaving it up to every player. But all the way back at the dawn of time, I remember talking about, like, well, what if I want to play an elf who was raised by humans? Do these proficiencies make sense? I want to make a human who was raised by elves. So can I have these proficiencies? I want to make a human who was raised by wolves. Can I have these proficiencies? Instead, you know, those conversations happened. They are made meaningful and they are assisted by having a good solid foundation. And the guess that, and when you're going to be creating new races for your games, you are doing just that. You're creating the new foundation on which your fantasy setting is going to exist. If all of your Dragonborn are now the Eastern peoples of your world, um, you still have nuance because they may have different nations, but that's just the people that populated that continent. Um, you know, just like you know, in fantasy, the in fantasy settings, you might have multiple kingdoms of elves. I know in my campaign setting, I have multiple kingdoms of elves, and while several of those kingdoms of elves would fall under the category of wood elf or high elf, they're not identical to one another. They have different outlooks. In fact, I've even tweaked their powers a bit to fit their environments or their particular outlook. And that's something you can do as well. But if you're looking to make new playable races specifically, it really helps to have a solid foundation with a small number of races that you can establish as your new core. Um, I mean, I as an experiment, I went through once and made a humans only campaign setting, but kept all the variety of the core races in D&D by basically just finding a way to turn all of those different races into different cultures of man, different different groups of man, fantasy humans. I guess along sort of the Robert E. Howard Conan way, where people of certain places were certain ways, and so you know it got a little tricky when I got to Dragonborn, but you could still write that up. I mean, it's easy enough to change Dragonborn from having breath weapons to having some sort of elemental aspect to them where they can now, they're men who can control an element. And in this culture, you have, oh, kind of think about it kind of like airbender wise, right? You're an airbender, you're an earthbender, you're a firebender. And so that's this culture of people, or this race of man. Whereas the half orcs can now become sort of your fill in for your fantasy barbarian people, or even your mighty civilized warrior people. Um, exactly. That's what I was saying. Is the benders and Avatar, uh, and like your halflings don't have to be short because really, if you're varying the species based and just using the standard abilities, the size of a race has very little mechanical effect game wise. And so like halflings could be human sized and not not break the game. Dwarves could be human sized and not break the game. So if you wanted to do an all human setting, but you still wanted to provide your players with variety in their character options, you could use every race that's in the book, just find a new way to make it human. You can also do that without copying the races, but that's a great shorthand. I've also done an experiment for a campaign where I turned every one of the races in D&D except for Dragonborn and Tieflings, like the old core races, turned them all into animals. You know, halflings were mice. You know, badgers were dwarves. Gnomes were hedgehogs. Um, that kind of a thing. If you want to get into sub races, you can even go ahead and start. The sub races of the various fantasy races. You can get more animals. Um, Miniature giant dwarfish halflings. Yeah, exactly. Miniature giant dwarf halflings. Um, but yeah, so I mean, a good example within D&D itself, I think, would be Dark Sun. If we're speaking about actual campaign worlds within D&D that took the standard races and then tweaked the crap out of them, Dark Sun is like the number one because the halflings were weird, the elves were weird, the dwarves in there were weird, and then we had other things like moles or mules, however they pronounced them, and then we had the half giants. Um, and then 3 Kreen were in there too. So a good example from TSR's history also, in where they kept sort of a core 4 that filled sort of the stylistic niche of the original D&D sort of races would be the core 4 in Star Frontiers, where you had your humans, you had your humans, Yazirians, Vrusks, and Dralicites. And within that, you had a short, stocky race, and you had a fighty race, and you had humans, and then you had kind of a cool thinking detached alien race. So you sort of had your dwarf halfling gnome, your half orc, your elf, and then humans. So you still had those spots in the spaces in the game. Now, Yazirians were not exactly half orcs, but they provided to the players that kind of fighty race, which is half orcs are kind of always typified as being sort of the more brutal, more combative type of character race. Whereas like the Dralicites were your short, stocky guy. So while their powers were completely different from anything dwarf, gnome, halfling, they were the short guy in the party. And the Vrusk were the cool-minded, business-like, kind of different thinking race that the elves are supposed to be in fantasy games, although people seldom play them that way. Um, that was kind of what they did, and you'll see this if you start looking at other RPGs and going through what they present as the player races in those RPGs. You'll see that framework of a core 4 to 6 species that are playable that fit certain roles. Your thinky race, your fighty race, your base, center midland doesn't do anything special race, and then like everything in between, those are all there as well in almost every game. uh, this It's funny you mentioned this. So one of my big banner waving soapbox standing moments was when people were insisting that turtles should be the longest lived race. in all of fantasy racedom because they um, because turtles are traditionally long lived, which is bullshit. But um, because that's not how fantasy races. But part of that, when I was thinking about that, is exactly this: fantasy races are essentially paragon representations, good and bad, of human aspirations or fears. Elves are the bright, shining, kind of elevated, spiritually magical, beautiful thing that some humans aspire to be. Dwarves, on the other hand, are that industrious, uh, driven, determined, loyal part that people wish they were. They are all those things, but they are not always positive, and they're not necessarily exactly in regard to the total argument. All of the fantasy human-like races are different than their mundane origins. They are not halflings, orcs, or halflings, elves, dwarves are like humans, but they're special in other ways that are different from humans. And so, like I was saying, the turtles don't necessarily have to be long lived because turtles are. Maybe that's their thing. Maybe that's their shtick. Because the other way that fantasy races are built is they're often built on inversions of human ideals. Let's see. Yeah, and that's exactly what I'm saying there, mages. And and so when you're designing those fantasy races, it's funny that we want to argue that the turtles should be the longest lived race in the game because turtles are so long lived. But at the same time, there are many other fantasy races in games that are based on animals that are not like their animal ancestry, so to speak. You have the wolfen, for example, in Palladium, that are wolves, but they're big empire building, like, warmongers. They're not like and but at the same time, wolf humanoids in fantasy are often ascribed to like very savage behaviors, whereas wolves, while they can be mean, are not savage and violent creatures. They're wolves who have their own limits and their own ideals within their packs and all of that, and they're much more grounded in and normal and than mythology and folklore would have them out to be. Yeah, Star Trek also tended to use races as stand-ins for nations that were relevant at the time as well. And as those nations have changed in relevancy, the races that stayed in the series have had to change. That's why, like, Klingons stopped being uh, communist Russia allegories and started becoming space Vikings. Um, because when that change happened, Russia was our friend, and so we stopped writing Russia as the enemies. Whereas the Romulans, to me, have always been very much China, um, and they continued to be in the '80s as they started in the '80s and the '90s as they started writing them into Next Generation. They very much started becoming very clearly an allegory for China. Um, and then when we needed bad bad actors in the Balkans again, we got Cardassians and the poor Bajorans that they were picking on. But yeah. uh, Yeah, I would say that that's kind of a chicken and the egg thing. It just did orcs become more like Klingons, or were orcs just more like becoming more like what the Klingons were also becoming? So maybe they were both becoming the same thing because um, I don't know if you're referring me to the World of Warcraft orcs, but I think one of the reasons that World of Warcraft kind of changed its orcs was because they were a playable race and they wanted people to get invested in them. And so they can't just be faceless, you know, pig faced, do batters all the time. They have to have families and reasons to be doing things. And I mean, the nice thing about World of Warcraft, at least for the core game, was that really who the good guy and the bad guy wasn't a matter so much of alignment. It was a matter of cultural outlook. Um, and that's kind of how like the Klingons changed too. Instead of becoming the competitor superpower that we were vying with to gain footholds in third party planet countries, they became that other race that had nuance and houses and religion and song and troubles of its own and problems back home and civil wars that they needed help with. And there was all that stuff going on with the Klingons. Oh yeah, the Klingon change happened as soon as Next Generation put one on the bridge of the Enterprise. I mean, I would say it probably started even sooner than that. It started probably as soon as Star Trek 3, where we got a good long look at Klingons. Even though they were still villains, the longer that a race is on screen, the more we get to know them and the more that we want to know them and learn about them. I mean, Kruge was a pretty badass captain for his little bird of prey, but he still got sad when his dog died. So, um, I think archetypes um, are going to be there in any discussion because they are archetypes. I firmly believe that archetypes exist in and of themselves, whether you're consciously applying them or not. You're going to have archetypes, and the because they're kind of just in our hardwiring. Um, Although they do change culture to culture. This is exactly the case. Now, that said, the one part of the current discussion that's happening on, like getting rid of, the all evil orcs and the mega cultures is that at the end of the day, complex cultures can still be good and bad and do bad things. So I love the argument that's like, well, your orcs have reasons for doing the things that they're doing, but at the end of the day, sure, they have reasons for doing them, but they're still doing them. And so, whether the orcs have really good internal reasons and whether they kiss their kids good night every night after they tell them bedtime stories, if their actions are still raiding human villages, they're still going to be looked on as evil. And the one thing, of course, that also always ties into the frequent modern misunderstanding of alignment in D&D as something that is prescribed rather than being descriptive. It's descriptive, not prescriptive. And so, you know, even in the old versions of D&D, you had orcs that weren't horrible, and you had evil druids, and you had you know you had variation. It just, as a game, you also have to have rules and defaults. Let's see. Yeah, that's exactly what it is. The more you see of these races, the more that they become a thing. I mean, the gazetteers for Beckme have an entire supplement on orcs and how to play them and the cultural nuance of orcs. So to sit there and say that in the old school there was never any attempt to make orcs better and that we always monocultured them is wrong. Even the description of the orcs in the player's handbook or in the monster manual, I should say, talks about there being different tribes. And it was very clear to me, even as an 8 to 10-year-old, that that meant that different tribes felt different ways. And the modules kind of showed that too. Exactly. Because the thing is, that argument also seems to fail to realize just how much damage nuanced and non-mega culture, megalithic cultured humans have done to each other. I mean, we've done plenty fine at being evil and nasty to each other with nuance. So nuance doesn't get rid of the evil orc. It just gives the orc reasons to be considered evil by some people. Yeah. Uh, Well, yeah, it's funny because this is the thing. Scandinavians are known for Vikings. Viking was an occupation, and a lot of people don't understand that it wasn't their culture. It was a thing that some of their people did. You know? um, yeah, so a lot of good comments coming through. Mages, I'm sure, has a lot to say on this. Orc of Thar. I'm not familiar with that one. You'll have to enlighten me on that one. Let's see. I I very much want to pick up the Gazetteers. I'm not gonna be able to buy originals because I imagine they're expensive, but I hear the print on demands are good. The only real drawback is they don't have the fold out maps, which would be really lovely. But the Gazetteers, I used to pick them up here and there when I was younger because I just sort of used them interchangeably with AD&D and stuff, but I wasn't like dedicated. Let's see. Yeah. Um, well, Glorantha, the world predates D&D, but Glorantha as a game doesn't predate D&D. Uh, and Glorantha was just, as far as I understand it, the world that RuneQuest borrowed or adopted to be their default world. I some of the versions of RuneQuest that were published were very loosely Gloranthized and seemed to be very much being presented more as generic D&D. Yeah. Um, was it controversial? I don't know, but hey, GM's Alcove is here. Hey, Fritz, and John, the old geek, is here. Giving your species race's depth can make the world so much richer. Yeah, it can. It does mean, but see, I think, and that is on the DM. I mean, yes, a game can write that in, but most games, if you really think about it, don't have the time or page count to do so, or can't guarantee that they're going to have the time or page count. So their core material is going to be very basic and very grounded, very foundational. It is only when they've lived long enough and proven themselves to be popular enough that they can start expanding. I mean, even Beckme, for all of the stuff that got wrote on it, it still had what, 2 3 versions of BX that it was born out of and the popularity that came with that. Um, so it it takes time to be able to work that into a game. And I think this is the trap that a lot of people fall into is they look at a game, they pick up a book, and they're like, "Oh, look at they did that. They did them a wrong. They did the orcs an injustice, or they did these people aren't people. They're just mindless things." And they don't think about that. This is just the basics. It's there's the nuance comes later. If you write if you write all the nuance in at the very beginning of the game, people get lost. Let's see. Oh, that's a bummer. Sounds like they had a good run though. Talking on Geek's daughter's game there. Let's see. Let's see. Let me catch up here. Yeah, I'm. Yeah, they're so that goes back to the whole thing too, where like if you make your races too unique and too weird, people you just lose people. Like in the going back to the miniatures reference from earlier, I could make a floating ball of tentacles as an alien species, but how do I really communicate that in miniature in shorthand that it's actually a people? In miniatures games, it's even harder because, of course, they're just there's purely a visual exercise. In an RPG, though, you'd have to really write hard and long to make that a believable race. A ball of tentacles that floats in the air is unlikely to be like other cultures that we can other cultures we can draw from on Earth. And that's the other problem is we can kind of only write what we know. Coming up with purely unique and interesting cultures is very difficult to do, and when you do succeed in doing it, it's usually really inaccessible to people. They read it and they're like, what did I just read? uh, yeah, exactly. There's a comment a comment I made earlier. It really comes down to the DM and the players. I mean, if a player is going to play an elf, I would say it's also on that player to play what his version of an elf is from where his character's from. Okay, you're a wood elf. What wood elven kingdom are you from, or what forest are you from? And when you encounter other wood elves in the game, how does your elf react to them? Some of the onus does fall back on the player, but the lion's share of that goes to the DM. Uh, well, yeah, and then he also always, talks about his bad English, but his English is great and it's much better than my Danish, which is still a tasty pastry to me. But uh, um, let's see. Yeah, and if you notice, when they're failing to understand each other, it's usually because the aliens are super weird. And imagine trying to communicate that in a sense where you're trying to have a player play them. I think one of the most glaring examples in 5e is lizard men. 5e lizard men as a playable race. They do a lot of good work in there describing how they have an alien mindset on the world and how they don't understand human emotions and they don't get it. But again, who's going to play that? Or it comes down to the player to play that and not just play the gecko guy in the party. Um, my brother played it really well. He had his lizard man was actually kind of to the point of getting slightly annoying because he was so alien. Like he knew that humans smiled for whatever reason, so he would try to smile. So he'd be like, and people would get nervous. Uh, he knew that adventuring was looking for something, but the lizard men have a weird concept of possessions, and they just kind of make what they need when they need it. And so he'd go around the dungeon picking up random things, going, "Is this what you're looking for?" And you know, that was his way of playing. He was at least trying to play the character as it's written in the supplements. Uh I would say that you are likely in the minority. Um, in that traditionally games that do this do poorly. You notice Talislanta is never elevated itself above cult popularity, um, and that's because it's opaque. You pull out that book and you're looking at 500 billion races, and you're trying to figure out what to play, and you're just gonna get lost. And I mean, let's see, blast new race every new race after race. That's how RPGs are supposed. That's how game supplements work, though. I mean, I'm not saying you're wrong for wanting that, and don't get me wrong. Please don't don't misunderstand what I'm saying. Um, there is a reason companies do it the way they do it. Um, Part of it is to sell product, but also part of it is to, if you put too much out too fast, you'll lose people, and they don't want to lose people. So trickling it out there. There's another really valid reason for this, and I think mages can maybe back me up on this, because I think we've talked about this before. And I think is that when you have too much upfront, individual choices cease to be meaningful. And also, if you have a glut of too many races up front, then the special races cease to also feel special. Um, Game wise, it also allows you time to play with those races, to use those races, and then when you're getting tired of them, the game company will have come out with new material. But also, a lot of times they release it in ways that are meaningful. Here is a new kingdom, and here are some races that live here. Here is a new part of the game setting, and here are some new species that exist here. Here's a new sector of space. Here are the races here. Star Trek does this for us all the time. Let's see. Yes, yes, Sexius. I know we have a game. It starts at noon my time, right? I believe so. Uh, so I I won't forget. Let's see. Yeah, lots of good comments coming through. Um, yeah, it takes time for people to learn how to play non-humans. Uh, yes and no. I feel like, again, it comes down to balance. In If you're gonna have one of those that really thinks differently as one of your core races, then you really have to kind of make sure that your other races are grounded. Let's see. Yeah, this is true. I mean, in fantasy writing, there's traditional and modern. Um, yeah, I would say having all of those choices up front is great fun for just, more casual fun. I mean, see Rifts, um, and then see Jim's comment here. Too many races and classes to choose from. Yes, um, but Rifts is written by a company who makes splat books look normal, by any other measure. Palladium's, especially Rift's books, are really just giant catalogs of stuff for people to play with very little meaning holding them together. And that's kind of been their style forever. There's very few, and also, I mean, if you think about even like the Robotech books from Rifts, the ones that everybody loved are the ones that were full of new mecha designs and OCCs and stuff like that. The ones that were almost all campaign stuff, not really as popular. Let's see. I don't know. Does Paizo take it to the extreme, or does Paizo just put out a lot of product? I mean, I don't think they're necessarily doing anything wrong by putting out a lot of product, because ultimately it's up to you what the pace is of the product you purchase and how you move you move stuff into your game. I have lots and lots of books with lots and lots of options for D&D, but I don't use them all. Um, and actually, I find them very useful, however, to have. And this is why I don't have a lot of problems with a lot of the tweaks and changes and all the race bloat that's happened for 5e, is because ultimately most people still tend to want to play the core races, at least in my experience when I've been playing. And also, I can limit what races I can play, but I have all of that work done for me when somebody wants to play something weird. And with the new ancestry rules, then it's really easy to custom make something for when that character has that really good character idea that is worth pursuing, but requires some mechanical tweaking. Let's see. Yeah. I mean, Rifts, as an example, is like there are 800 million versions of power armor in that game. And really, it comes down to just which one you thought looked coolest in the illustration, or whether or not you were a fan of NGR or the Coalition. So, oh, so many comments. Redfield, welcome. Let's see. Most exotic race in D&D is a human. Just look. Uh, yes and no. In my current campaign, there are, well, when we started, there were 3 humans out of 5 players. So, um, but your mileage may vary. I hear that it's an issue at other tables. So this is one thing I always wanted in fantasy races. And this is kind of one of the things I do like about Eberron. I'm not a fan of Eberron, but I like the landscape of the world. Is instead of having races sort of just being splattered all over the world with humans gluing everything together, they races have places they came from and kingdoms. And it's in a fantasy setting with all these intelligent races, why don't we see a political social political landscape that is, instead of France, England, Germany, Holland, Italy, we have elf kingdom, orc kingdom, human kingdom. you know we should have that more often. Excuse me. um Cal, that is your choice. I have spent money on books from WotC, and I see no reason not to use them, because I paid good money for them. uh, yeah, I think that you can kind of see this on the other side of the argument. So like player races, but if we look at, so for example, the races available to the GM to throw at the players, we're really given very little that is substantively different. Sorry, I got caught up on the word. Between an orc, a goblin, a hobgoblin, a bugbear, and a kobold, they're all just kind of like, you got your small, medium, large, and your supersized humanoid. Um, and then kobolds are like your value pack. But and You know, you get like a bag of 16 of them for $5, but they're all kind of interchangeable. Let's see. Yeah, me too. Um, I do have problems with the power level in 5e, but I've come to terms with it because I now play 5e to play 5e. There are other D&Ds and other RPGs that I can play for other flavors of fantasy, and those still exist. They're still on my shelf. They still get made. They still get produced. They still get created. And as a homebrew GM, somebody who's almost exclusively homebrew, I am very, very much not tied to the whims of any particular company. Although I will freely admit that I restored my D&D Beyond subscription because I'm running my stuff online, and it's just such an easy tool to use. So if I was doing stuff at the table, I probably would have let it go. But let's see. You can. Full Metal Dragon. I mean, that's a good way. You can do it because I mean, just like most kingdoms in medieval Europe had cultures that overlapped because people live in places and nations tend to not care who's living there when they form. So you had that. And in my current game, like I mentioned earlier, I have wood elves in multiple places. They're very different people. The wood elves in the Blackthorn Forest are nasty, almost distinct from the wood elves of the one coastal forest nation whose name escapes me at the time because I am not Ed Greenwood and do not somehow have an encyclopedic memory of everything I've written. Either that or he makes it up as he goes along. Let's see. All right. I am not familiar with this one, but I'll have to go take a look at it. I don't think so. I don't think enough of my followers are really that firmly entrenched in the WotC drama. Honestly, mega corporation is going to do what a mega corporation is going to do. I am a cyberpunk player from back in the day. I have no faith in capital in rampant capitalism. So, um, you know, Hasbro, Arasaka, same thing. But um, let's see. All right, so we are at the 11 o'clock mark, and while this could go longer, I think we've kind of covered the subject and had a nice discussion on some of the nuances there. Um, uh, but yeah, I hope this got you thinking because that was ultimately and I've actually talked on this in a previous video, to some extent. Just really, it's a matter of balancing things out, and creating new races does not necessarily mean having to recreate game mechanics. You can use the same races that are in the game, just give them a different overlay, reskinning them, I guess you could say, and just playing with the dynamics. I mean, who says that the mechanics for elf can't be used for your dwarves? Now your dwarves are these magical beings who live high in the mountains and forge their ancient spells. You know, there you go. You now have magic dwarves. Um, but yeah, thank you, Full Metal Dragon. And Cal and everybody, do have yourselves a great Sunday. I'm going to go ahead and call the stream here. Thank you all for coming out. Mage's Musings, GM's Alcove, The Old Geek, all good channels to take a look at. Um, they do good stuff, and keep an eye out because on the 29th It's not going to be on the stream, but it will be on the Discord. I'm going to be in the morning running a Call of Cthulhu game. And if you came in and like listened, and even if you weren't playing, I would not chase you away. And then, yeah. So other stuff will be coming here. Sunday videos for the most part, Sunday streams for the most part. Occasionally on Monday when I'm trying to get somebody here that can't do a Sunday. Trying to get some other videos in between the weekends because it seems like there's an awful lot of dead space there, but I'm working on it. Have a good one, everybody. Get out and game and enjoy your weekend.